Director Alternate.
Classified. You understand? Get projections until I can figure out what
So what you had talked previously about your whole proposal.
From what we budgeted.
$5,000 increase is,
Not very much.
okay. What is the percentage here?
Yes. Do you have the number there? If he calls in, do you want me to?
I don't write up these programs, College. As I said, my job is just to get this done.
There's talented people down there. We can get a hold of a lot of people, but it's just a matter of...
Well, if you'll take the responsibility of pulling the group together to be sure.
That showed 163, a projected 168. It looks like.
Any good manager that's worth his salt is going to be an individual that can solve problems.
It's frustrating at times. There's sometimes more problems than you can handle in a given day. But there's a great deal of satisfaction as you overcome these problems one at a time.
You got to get a kick out of it. I mean, you got to come in every day and say, shoot, this is what I enjoy doing it, and I'm the best at it, and I'm going to get even better if I apply myself.
Yeah. If I had to sit down and take a pencil and write a description of the ideal job, I really believe I would describe the job I'm doing today.
It's a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour-a-day job.
There is no question that it's tough, and our one constant companion is exhaustion.
Not everyone can be happy being a manager.
Personally, it's a very, very demanding job.
So that we have to know that there are prices to be paid and benefits to be gained, and each of us has to ask ourselves, how high is up for me? And how much of a price am I willing to pay, and what benefits do I think I will gain?
Organized world. They assume that the functions of management are performed in the soothing confines of well-insulated executive suites. Well, the fact is that a typical day in the life of most managers is rarely so well ordered and predictable. Interruptions, exceptions, delays, shortages, these are the realities that make the manager's workday both stimulating and unnerving, rewarding and frustrating. If there's one skill that all managers need, it's the ability to change gears quickly and meet a constant series of making decisions, solving problems, taking charge. In other words, meeting a never-ending series of challenges. Now, management is a profession that offers substantial rewards, but demands a great deal. Now, because it is such a demanding field, anyone considering a career in management needs to find out just exactly what a managerial world is really like.
The most exciting aspect of the job is its unstructured nature, and that there are very large problems that need to be solved in a time when our corporation is in the throes of change, if you will. And these problems require a lot of management attention and careful thinking and the development of unique strategies unique to our corporation, as we are not like any other. And I'm a part of that and find it extremely challenging.
I get a lot of satisfaction out of achievement. Looking into an uncertain world and taking a creative posture as to the direction that I think we ought to go, casting that in objectives and moving there and then getting there and saying, yeah, we did it. Or no, we didn't do it, but what could we do next time to make it? That to me is the thrill of management.
Good afternoon, the Ford Corporation. May I help you?
And sure, it's demanding and it's frustrating because you many times don't have all of the necessary time, the necessary resources. There are many, many constraints that are placed on any manager to get his job done. But but that's what it's all about, because your ability as an individual or as a manager to take whatever resources you've got, whatever time you've got, and in whatever situation you're involved in, and put them together and do the very best you know how to do is really going to determine how good your organization is compared to someone else's, or how good your company is compared to your competition.
Perhaps the toughest element of the job is knowing that you have a serious problem to work out and not knowing exactly how to approach it, but also knowing that there are a number of other people faced with the same problem, and it's time to work together to develop a reasonable solution that may take years to work its way out. So you have to deal with ambiguity daily, and that can be very frustrating.
Relying on the backup services, those that I must rely on to get things to me or to supply me, is the biggest frustration I have. Other than that, there are none. They're challenges, they're not frustrations. The challenge of getting something done that's impossible. The challenge when a customer brings something in and says, I've been everywhere else, can you do it? Can I have it tomorrow? They're minute frustrations, but they're really challenges because you can get them done.
In talking with working managers, a number of words continually come up. Words like challenge, decisions, conflict, frustration, excitement. It quickly becomes obvious that the world of management is not a place for those who like to observe things from a distance. It's an active, get-involved world, a world propelled by intensity, competition, and frequent change. Is it for everybody? Definitely not. But for those who thrive on these elements, it's a very exciting place to be. Now, with this general idea of what life in the managerial fast lane is like, we can now move on to some specifics. And we know that management involves planning, organizing, staffing, directing, controlling. But the question is, what skills does a manager need to perform these functions?
The job of a manager is I think, not really all that different than the job of an individual contributor. The primary difference is that your performance as a manager is really measured by your ability to multiply individual efforts, and which really says that you've got to be able to couple hundreds, thousands of individual contributors and individual levels of organizations into an effective team. And in my book, the real measurement of a manager is a measurement of his organization and his people.
On the other hand, it's the leader manager's job to make sure that they grow to their potential and that their contribution is focused in such a way that the organization achieves its goals as well. I see my job as mainly a servant leader job. My job is to take care of the people that are within my span of control, and that's the number one priority. Therefore, the creative work I do or the day-to-day routine kind of work that most executives in my position do, I really don't consider that my top priority. If a person has a need, if a person is upset or needs a decision made, they can walk in my office at any time. Literally, my door is closed maybe a total of 3 or 4 hours a year, and they can walk in and take my time whenever they need to get their job done, or whenever they need counseling, or whenever they need to have a problem dealt with or integrated with other people at their level.
I think there's so much time needed for the open communications, the accessibility of an employee to get to you, no matter what level, that if you count on spending an 8 to 5 day, you're not available when they need you. You're busy with your phone calls, with your outside duties, Chamber of Commerce, business meetings, whatever. You don't have the time for them to see you. Some of my most valuable time starts at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. because people know, they learn to know that I'm always here at 4 o'clock to almost 6 o'clock at night.
A leader manager has to be able to shift gears quickly because just about the time you're coming up with this great advance in management technique, somebody walks in your office mad as hell at somebody else in the organization for some reason, most of the time because they really didn't communicate before they started doing whatever it was that they were doing. And you have to put on your counselor and your integrator hats and try to help them solve their problem in such a way that they don't have to come back to you again with that same problem. It's very, very frustrating sometimes.
You've got to recognize that people are the primary ingredient to any organization's success or failure. And so from that viewpoint, I think the human relations aspects of understanding people are just absolutely essential. You know, I've seen many cases of management failure where the individual worked extremely hard, was extremely intelligent, but yet failed to recognize that his efforts were a reflection of his people's efforts, and therefore he didn't spend adequate amount of time of communication to his employees or to listening to the problems, to involving them in the decision process and so forth.
Almost all business problems in one way or another can be related to communication. And having a strong background in how to teach, how to communicate, how to receive communication, which a lot of people out of school don't understand. I get a lot of people out of school who know how to give outgoing communication but don't know how to accept incoming communication. Getting the biases out of the way, understanding what bias is and where it comes from, knowing yourself, all those things are part of becoming a skilled communicator. One of the things that we try to teach all our leader managers here is counseling skills, the skills that a psychologist or a counselor uses in helping individuals in personal growth situations. And that's basically what management is.
Here again, the major issue is how do you deal with people? And my experience in the business world has been that the single most important thing relates to people. It is the identification of gifted people, the recruitment of these people, the motivation of these people, the recognition of them by giving them credit, not assuming it yourself, and the proper rewarding of people. If you can do that, you can be a good manager. If you don't know how to do that, I'm fairly certain that you may be an adequate manager, but not a very good one.
The human relation skills are the most important thing. The other things, we have engineers for the technical or maintenance people to handle the technical. You have to have a certain basic knowledge in order to give the right direction. But the most important skill is that people have to do the job, and you have to motivate the people to do the job. Sometimes through just talking to them, other times through discipline. But the people, the human relation skill is the most important skill you develop as a manager.
Communications, human relations, motivation. These are key areas in which managers must develop their skills. In addition to these people-oriented functions, managers need to become more proficient in a number of other areas.
The business of accounting, in the general sense, keeping score, is an area that every leader manager, no matter what function he's in, whether he's a marketing person or in legal or in line management in the manufacturing organization, R&D, every leader manager should understand how to keep score and what the issues are and what the systems are. And that takes a lot of hard work, and it's boring. Most people who are creative think that learning that structure is one of the most boring, debilitating things they'll ever be challenged to do. But on the other hand, and I felt the same way when I had to learn that. I didn't have a choice. I happened to want to be a leader manager when I got out of undergraduate school. I took the job on purpose. I hated it. I was never so glad as when I went back to graduate school and got through doing that. But I spent 2 years learning those skills of keeping score. And of all the things that I know now, outside of my people skills, that is the most valuable. Another set of skills that leader managers have to understand involves systems. you don't have to be a computer expert, but you have to understand basic systems design. You have to understand feedback, you have to understand tolerances, you have to understand the different theories that go into systems. I find in both the accounting skills and the system skills that a strong mathematic background is very, very important. In fact, I've had the opportunity a couple times to hire math majors, which most people won't hire unless they have a statistics job or some kind of number crunching to do. But if you can find a math major with a glimmer of human skills, you've got the makings of a super top manager, because that person has the thought processes trained into him to acquire these other skills very rapidly, which is another of the problems, is acquiring these things in depth in a fairly short period of time. And that's basically what management is. You have some technical skills, which are keeping score, you have design skills, which are mainly systems oriented, and you have the communication skills, which involve the human resource. And when you get those three areas down pat, if you've got a sound management philosophy to back that up, which has to fit all your other values, and the values of the organization, and the values of the community, and the values of the economy in general in business, then you're well on your way to being a very, very successful person in business, no matter which business you go into.
In addition to skills in human relations and communications, accounting and systems, managers need several other skills. Now, one of these is the ability to think clearly and separate what's important from what's not. Now, this is especially critical in decision-making and problem-solving, where an overabundance of information can create confusion. Now, another key managerial skill is the capacity to look ahead, to plan for the future. There's very little that's static in the managerial world, and managers must be able to anticipate change and plan accordingly. And finally, managers must be able to prioritize, to effectively juggle the flood of conflicting demands that constantly bombard them. This requires the ability to work quickly, to cope with pressure, and to deal with a great many different things at once. Now, these skills pertain, of course, to all managers at every level. However, as a manager progresses in his or her career, the skill demands tend to change.
I've found that as I've moved up the managerial ladder, the demands for my skills have changed as far as the pressures that you receive on a day-to-day basis in decision-making, for example. The consequences of those decisions are much more detrimental if they're wrong. The need to be more creative at times has increased. The need to delegate, to get the work done and to pull out of the everyday processing and do more of the directing has increased.
When you're working on the first level as supervisor, you're involved in the nuts and bolts of the operation. Every operation, you have to know everything about it so that you can show the people what needs to be done. If they're doing something wrong, point them in the right direction, correct it. As you move up the organization, you're supervising that same person. You have to realize his problems and try to understand them and help him with them. But your main objective is to help that man do his job. And that involves working with the other departments much more. It'd be the engineering department, the personnel department, maintenance department, what it takes to help that man. And you have to forget about doing first level supervisor's job. If you continue to do his job for him, then you don't need him. And it's sometimes the hardest thing to do is forget the job you're doing before and do your boss's job. So it's a hard step to take. But once you make it, then you get a much bigger picture of the operation, and then you can help your department from a higher level and look for higher goals for the department.
Now, as you move up the ladder, the hands-on disappear to a certain extent. The planning becomes more important. The organization is important. Staffing is always a key, but because if you have the right staff, theoretically, you shouldn't have to worry about a lot of things, but it doesn't always work out that way. But control of knowing what is happening and whether or not it has happened and what the results are, I feel is one of the key areas as you move up the ladder. I have to know what's going on in our organization. I can't do it, obviously. We depend upon a staff to do it. You recruit, train the staff. Our management staff here has the authority and the responsibility to handle their specific areas. You give that to them and let them go. Then you determine whether or not they are doing it.
Usually by the time you get into mid-career, somewhere in your late 30s or early 40s, then you've got to shift into more a conceptual or philosophical approach, because then you have to look at broader subjects. You have to be much more familiar with a lot of different aspects of business rather than just a technical or functional skill. Usually you don't get to that point unless you have that skill.
Just as the demands made on managers continually change, so too can managerial skills be changed to meet these demands. Weaknesses can be overcome, strong points can be made stronger. Now, many organizations offer in-house programs which can help managers to improve themselves. These programs include company-sponsored seminars, workshops, coaching techniques, even college courses taught right on the premises. Now, in addition to taking part in these kinds of programs, many managers improve their skills through seminars available outside the organization. Now, regardless of which approach is used, a manager should begin the process by assessing his or her personal strengths and weaknesses and doing it as honestly as possible.
We all have different backgrounds and different makeups, and fundamentally we have different strengths and weaknesses. And what you must do, whether you be a leader or a follower, is recognize what your strengths and weaknesses are, because all of us lead to a certain degree in whatever we do. And so you must recognize what your strengths and weaknesses are, first of all, personally. You know, it's something you need to really soul search yourself to understand what are my goals, and therefore what am I trying to get out of life, and therefore what are my strengths and weaknesses, and what can I do to improve, and so forth.
Trial and errors is probably the one way you build your skills. You can study, you can read about right approaches, but you have to try these approaches. And if you make a mistake, you have to look at yourself. You know, first of all, you have to admit to yourself you made a mistake, and then find out what the mistake is, and then look for a different answer, and observe what other people do, and whether it works or doesn't work. And if you learn from this and think about it, then the next time you might not make the same mistake over again.
The opportunities to develop skills never stop. I think you have to keep working at it. You have to continue to go to various schools and seminars to keep yourself up. In any business that is technical, you have to stay up with the technical end of it.
This solves two things. It gives you additional skills and learning. It also gives you very high visibility within your organization that you're a mover.
I've worked in production, I've worked in industrial engineering, I've worked in process engineering, and I worked in quality control. And I learned that every person has to do their own job, and each one has its problems. But if you work together toward a common goal, then everyone's job is easier. And that developed my skills more than anything else, because I know the other man's problems a little bit better, and if I help him correct his problems, he's going to help me to correct mine, and the organizational benefit.
Obviously, it's not possible to know in advance exactly what any career will be like. But there are certain facts of managerial life that any aspiring manager can count on. Now, for example, as we've already observed, management is a challenging career, one that's intensely demanding and yet richly rewarding. We also know that being a manager requires a wide range of skills that change somewhat over time and which need to be upgraded constantly. Now, according to the American Management Association. In addition to managerial skills, there are also a number of personal traits which most successful managers possess. Now, the first of these is a desire to wield power within the organization. In other words, to be in a position to make decisions. Now, secondly, a manager who doesn't have the immediate power should at least be driven to gain influence. That is, to have some impact on those who do have the power to make decisions. And finally, a successful manager must have the capacity to empathize, to understand what makes other people the way they are. Now, the answer to the question, do I want to become a manager, will of course vary from one person to the next, but in order to make the right decision, the aspiring manager must compare his or her skills, interests, attitudes, traits with those needed in the manager's world. Now, once that's done, anyone who does decide to make management a career should then formulate a plan of action and a timetable for developing those managerial skills necessary for establishing a successful career.
And once you have put together a portfolio of skills in terms of administration abilities, in terms of your own technical skills, and most fundamentally in terms of your ability to supervise people, once you put those three things together and do it effectively, the real thrill is when you sit back and you see things that were just a twinkle in your eye, and goals and objectives that you weren't really sure that they could be accomplished, and putting an effective team together, and not only accomplishing those objectives, but doing even more than what you ever envisioned possible.
Being a manager in any industry, but particularly in American industry, where you have a lot of latitude about what you do, is probably the greatest challenge. When you see people.
Peace Theater presents.
Good afternoon, Forum Corporation. May I help you? Thank you. I'll connect you.
I can't get projections until I can figure out which set of figures is correct.
Also, what you had talked previously about, your whole proposal, if we could get a copy of that.
Sure.
Free down from what we budgeted.
$5,000 increase is, okay. What is the percentage here?
Yeah. Do you have the number there? If he calls in, do you want me to?
I don't write up the top knowledge. As I said, my job is just to get this stuff out. But
be able to do some long-range planning. Long-range planning is very, very
Yes, we need to go ahead and provide additional services out there. Just
we have the people. There's talented people down there, and we can get a hold of a lot of people, but it's just a matter of...
Well, if you'll take the responsibility of pulling the group together to be sure.
An actual 163, a projected 168. It looks like...
Communication, the process of transferring ideas, thoughts, and feelings and making them understood. It's a process that dominates our lives and virtually every aspect of human behavior. Most people spend about 80% of their waking hours communicating. In fact, it's such a universal part of human experience that it's often taken for granted. There's a widely held assumption that communicating is a fairly simple and instinctive process that comes to people naturally. In fact, what studies have shown and what managers are beginning to recognize more and more is that communicating is an extremely subtle and surprisingly complex activity. Tests indicate that the average person retains only half of what's said. And within 48 hours, that figure declines to a retention level of about 25%. For the modern manager, as an individual who must work with others to achieve organizational objectives, the ability to communicate is crucial. In fact, it may well be the single most important skill a manager can possess. At first glance, the process of transferring meaning appears simple enough. It begins with the formulation of an idea. This step is called ideation. The person who wants to communicate must send or transmit this idea. To do this, the sender encodes the message, that is, puts it into a set of meaningful symbols. Language is our most common code, and words are its symbols. Gestures, actions, sounds, and images are less obvious, but we all use them or respond to them at one time or another. The medium for the communication is the format or technical means by which the message reaches the receiver. This might be a letter, telephone, report, conversation, or a cassette tape. Transmission is the act of exposing the coded message to the receiver by means of the chosen medium. This is the act of mailing the letter, making the phone call, publishing the report, holding the conversation, or turning on the cassette recorder. At this point, the transmission must be received and decoded. Decoding is the process of converting the symbols into a facsimile of the sender's original idea. All this sounds rather obvious, but what appears simple enough in theory can be fairly complicated in practice.
At every step, the process of communicating is susceptible to human error. At the ideation stage, a sender may not think out an idea very clearly, and an error, an oversight in thinking will probably result in a communication that's confused or obscure. Or during the act of coding, the search in writing, speaking, or gesture for symbolic equivalence of the idea may be faulty. And this can lead to communication which is ambiguous or unclear. For example, it was reported in a leading business journal that a government agency needed radioactive rods. A request was written for 10-foot-long rods. Instead of rods that were each 10 feet long, they got 10-foot-long rods, 10 rods that were each 1 foot long.
Another source of ambiguity in our everyday language is one that grows out of human emotions. Much of the communication that takes place between people involves sentiments and feelings. This is particularly true when so-called red flag words are used. These are terms that elicit an instant emotional response in the receiver, such as unionism, welfare, communist, nuclear power, and oil company. Because words like these carry such strong emotional content for some people, they tend to color communication. As a result, they should be used very carefully.
There's a good deal of ambiguity in the figures of speech that run through everyday conversation. Now, we've all heard managers saying things like, well, basically it's a matter of robbing Peter to pay Paul, or when you go in there, you better have your ducks all lined up in a row, or, well, if that happens, we'll just have to drop back and punt. Now, all these phrases do have one thing in common: images. And in certain situations, an image can be a very concise way to communicate an idea. For example, the phrase, robbing Peter to pay Paul. Now, that might be accurate enough to describe a policy of depleting funds in one reserve to fund expenditures properly falling under another aspect of the operation. But now, if the phrase were used to characterize debit financing, or aged receivables, or even revenue participation, the phrase would not only be inappropriate, but misleading. More often than not, people do not use metaphors precisely, which increases the potential for ambiguity and confusion. So the key to using figures of speech is to be sensitive to all the possible implications of a particular figure of speech. Managers should ask themselves if they're using a metaphor to improve communication or just as a shortcut in coding an idea that they don't really understand.
Another common communication problem is wordiness. This is often the result when a sender tries to clarify confused thinking with long-winded explanations.
I can remember in the early days, my first monthly reports probably covered 22 to 25 pages. And as I think back on those, they'd have to be a disaster. No one read them, no one understood what I was saying. It was too lengthy. I lost the main thoughts and all the verbiage. I put in all the best words that I knew at that time and totally destroyed the concept. Today, a report will cover maybe 1 page. Now, it seems a shame that it's taken me 30 years to find out that people need it condensed in a concise form that they can understand. But that was a change in my thought process.
Only if he's got a letter from the boss.
Another critical area in the chain of communication is the medium. If the sender chooses an inappropriate medium, communication may be impeded. For example, a manager might write a memo when he or she should have a face-to-face conversation. In addition, the context in which the communication occurs can often create barriers. For example, employees frequently don't voice true opinions to the boss, and managers often filter out everything except what concerns their division. And these are just the problems facing the sender. There's also a whole series of obstacles that affect the listener. Managers need to be aware that few employees read or listen effectively. According to a number of communications experts, the financial toll of poor listening is enormous. Letters have to be retyped. Appointments need to be rescheduled. Labor management relations break down. Ultimately, productivity is affected and profits decline. If 100 million workers in this country were each to make a $10 mistake because of poor listening, the cost to business would be $1 billion.
All of us were taught to speak, to read, and to write. Few of us, however, were ever taught to listen. Most of us assume that our listening skills don't need improving, but the fact is that for many of us, these are the very skills that need to be upgraded. And there are a number of ways to do this. Now, for one thing, listening should be active, not passive. It is the listener who should take primary responsibility for the success or the failure of communication. Now, another thing, try to find areas of interest in the sender's message. Don't shut out subjects just because they seem to be dry and uninteresting. In addition, it isn't always easy, but it is a good idea not to focus on the manner of delivery, but concentrate instead on what's being said. Now, part of this is listening for the main idea rather than the isolated facts. Restricting attention to isolated facts may cause the primary thrust of the entire communication to be missed. Now, it's best not to react to emotional words. Instead, concentrate on why the speaker is using them. Now, it's also imperative to keep an open mind while listening. All too often, understanding is impaired by preconceived notions. Now, we all constantly search for information that fits into our own personal, pre-existing thought patterns. These thought patterns are patterns that we develop throughout the course of our lives based on what we believe to be true. And information and ideas that fit into these patterns or beliefs are certainly accepted quite readily. But information and ideas that do not fit in are often rejected or, at best, confused. Now, beyond the problem of preconceived notions are the physical obstacles of noise, interruption, and the proper audibility or visibility of communication.
In the late 1970s, the aircraft division of a major aerospace company experienced a severe productivity slump. Production schedules weren't met, costs steadily increased, absenteeism was 3 times that of any other division, and the attrition rate exceeded 2% per month. In 1979, the corporation hired a consulting firm to look into the situation and propose solutions. The consultants discovered that morale in the division was extremely low. A major cause was the inability of recently promoted managers to communicate with younger employees, women, and contractors. Of these new managers, 63% had been recently promoted from the ranks of engineers and technicians. They had little management training and virtually no management experience. At the suggestion of the consulting firm, all managers were given crash courses in interpersonal skills with an emphasis on communications. These courses stressed the importance of listening with an open mind, the use of feedback techniques, and brevity. Within 6 months, absenteeism dropped dramatically. Attrition settled back to an acceptable 0.5% rate, and productivity returned to pre-slump levels. A related example concerns a manufacturing company which established a very unusual program to improve the interpersonal communication skills of its managers. In this program, managers in groups of 3 are assigned the roles of presenter, questioner, and monitor. The presenter is required to describe his or her job responsibilities to the questioner. The questioner listens to what's being said and directs the discussion. The monitor ensures that the communicating skills taught in the program are used in this discussion of the presenter's job. The key stages in the exercise are questioning and paraphrasing. These are integral components of the feedback process, which is vital to effective communication. It should be noted that the focus during the exercise is on the communication process itself rather than on the subject matter.
Okay. In response to what it is that he said. Then your question allows you to advance into some more territory. Okay. So now, you're going to be doing this in your job, so
right.
The typical thing is that you're trying to convey, crucial thing is that you're conveying your role and your responsibilities, because we want to eliminate the gray matter on responsibilities. Take it.
Start with a question. Joe, what is your job title and what are your responsibilities?
Well, my job title is line supervisor, and essentially my responsibilities are to get our product, the cars, off the line and into the showrooms. And
okay, let me understand then. Your responsibility is to, in productivity, to take your cars from the lines into the showrooms.
It's to get it all the way from the initial assembly, all the way through the production and out. Right now, with all that entails, from personnel to technology, it's...
Lisa, a good step here is to ask him to say, just a strategy for eliciting the specific things that he means by those major categories. Ask him to say, now, typically...
Most courses on listening stress the importance of questioning the person who presents information in order to confirm that what the receiver heard was indeed what the sender intended. Questioning is a key part of the training program. It's an excellent technique for exposing possible gaps in thinking, words, and metaphors used by the sender. Following the initial communication training session, managers at this organization have detailed one-to-one discussions about their job responsibilities with their immediate supervisor. In the second session, the managers talk about what they actually do as opposed to the activities specified in their job descriptions. The program sounds simple, yet it has helped clarify points of organization and responsibility in the minds of both managers and their supervisors. Also, it has dramatically increased the efficiency and creativity of the managerial staff. By purposely cultivating communication skills, firms like this one are realizing dramatic improvements in productivity.
The basic components of both speech and writing are words. Now, since most words have several meanings, they have a built-in ambiguity. In our culture, very few people speak or write clearly enough to convey to others precisely what they mean when they use a particular word. And in addition, most people have their own unique view of the world, so they tend to interpret the words of others according to their own views and interests. And this is particularly true in the organizational environment where goals, deadlines, and competition often color people's perception.
When you're dealing with these kinds of problems, we found out by accident about 12 years ago that the interpersonal relationships between people are very important, and there are several assumptions that we make about the world which are not right and have to be corrected. Most important of this is that we all think the standards that exist, the fact that this table is made out of wood, is brown, that everybody perceives it that way, but there's not the fact that someone may really talk about the beautiful grain, someone else may talk about the different shades of brown, and what I like as a shade of brown may be very tiresome or something, or dark to someone else. So we have to remember, first of all, that our standards of perception are relative, not absolute. And once you understand that, then we're able to see that things that don't necessarily are pleasing to us may be pleasing to someone else. Likewise, the sentences and the words that I use, that I understand, are difficult to comprehend by the party I'm talking to. The second important thing that we deal with in this configuration is the fact we have to assume that the behavior of the other person is rational from his own viewpoint. Even though it may be irrational to us and say that this is not very important, when we deal with people, we have to assume what that person is saying and what he's doing is correct and from his viewpoint, and therefore we have to dress ourselves to that level of rationality. And those two factors, I think, are very important when we're dealing with communication, so that's what we've started to get across to people, that if you understand how you see the world, then you're also able to make assumptions about the other party that you're dealing with. And from there, then, the communications process takes place.
In spite of all the talk about communication, I think for the most part we misunderstand it. We think that it's a sending of messages, but it isn't. I can't send you a message. I can only send you symbols. And the extent to which your internal dictionary has a similar set of meanings activated by my symbols as my dictionary has, to that extent we've been able to communicate. But I cannot send you a message. I can only send you symbols. And once you understand that then, and sense that our brains are trying to interface, but our views of the world may be different, I can then look at the problem of organization, communication in a different light. And I can begin to design communication, messages, whether through various kinds of media or through personal exchange, that match the way different kinds of people think. So there are some cases then when I can transmit on a single frequency, as though each person has a special cut antenna on top of his or her head. I can hit that particular antenna with a single kind of broadcast, speaking one psychological language. But in dealing with different value systems in organizations that are very complex, I have to simulcast, which means I have to speak different psychological languages. So
companies are fast realizing that to communicate at one level, you need one style. To communicate at another, you may need an entirely different style. At one level, you can talk at the abstract. At another, you need to talk in very specific terms about the numbers of units of production which need to come out. And organization communication is very much the study of what it is you need to say to an employee to help him understand his role in the production process.
As important as words are to communication, research suggests that the dictionary meaning of words accounts for only 10% of our communication. Most of the other 90% is communicated non-verbally by our hands, face, body posture, and gestures. There are many things that we imply with gestures, expressions, or tone of voice that we're unable to put into words. For this reason, some of the most important parts of communication are conveyed by gestures or movement. Several books on body language suggest that there's a single meaning for every gesture. For example, crossed arms are supposed to imply defensiveness. But this gesture, like many others, can imply a great number of things, from being cold, to poor posture, to deep thought. Like words, gestures can be ambiguous. Managers need to be sensitive to body language, but not dogmatic in interpreting it. Nonverbal communication is something salespersons are trained to be sensitive to, because interpersonal sensitivity is crucial to making a sale. For example, when an experienced salesperson is making a presentation, he'll continually look around the room, trying to detect any emotional responses in the listeners. Another factor affecting communication that a manager can influence is the context of the communication. Context, in this sense, connotes any background relationship or setting that influences the communication. For example, there's almost always a power or authority relationship at work in any conversation. An individual speaking to the boss is speaking to a person who evaluates that person's performance and who wields considerable power. Power can create barriers to communications, but these can be broken down through diligence and sensitivity.
One of the three elements of getting people to behind you as a leader, the three elements that are very important would be that they understand what they're doing, that they trust the leader, and that they've had some participation in the whatever it is they're being asked to do. Now, you can't do any of those. You can't have any of those present unless the leader communicates clearly, unambivalently, and creates an atmosphere where he can be heard. Quite often when people get into a room with a boss or an authority figure, especially a big shot, they get very anxious or they mistrust. And there's a tremendous amount of distrust, as everybody knows these days, toward our institutions and our leadership.
In the communication relationship, it's very important for a manager to create a relaxed atmosphere. An employee needs to trust the manager enough to communicate openly, without fear. So, when an executive wants to discuss something with a subordinate, should they meet in the executive's office or in the subordinate's? Now, if the executive wants to reach out to the subordinate to enlist support or show encouragement, the meeting should be held in the subordinate's office. But if the executive wants to emphasize his or her position of supremacy, the meeting should be held in the executive's office. The principle here is that of territoriality. Most people feel more at ease in their own offices than in their superiors. So even this simple matter of where a conversation takes place can have a profound impact on the process of communication.
Another aspect of context that can affect communication is the arrangement of furniture. The typical office places the manager or executive behind a large desk with seating for visitors across the desk. Offices that place chairs or sofas at right angles encourage interchanges that are more relaxed and personal. Offices that put a large desk between those conversing emphasize the power of the person behind the desk. One way to de-emphasize that power is by using circular tables. They're as old as King Arthur and still serve the same purpose: to downplay authority and to encourage the equal participation of everyone involved. Finally, the door to the office is also extremely important in the transmission of communication. A door can be manned by a gatekeeper whose job is to manage access to the person behind it, or it can be kept open to foster open communication with subordinates.
Some of my most valuable time starts at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because people know, they learn to know that I'm always here at 4 o'clock to almost 6 o'clock at night. And that opportunity gives them a chance to pop in. And I find people who walk by the door, look in the doorway to see if I'm here. I know that unless I say something to them, they will not come in. They're kind of looking, I can wave and say hi, and they'll stop and say, "Do you have just a moment?" And that's really important time, because they're looking for me and they don't quite know how to get through the door, and I almost have to invite them in. So not only availability, but accessibility is important in managing.
Effective interpersonal communication is a vital part of quality management. As we've seen, it's not a simple, instinctive activity that you can just take for granted. Interpersonal communication is based on a number of interrelated skills that can be improved through diligent practice. A manager should should be sensitive not only to words, but to gestures, facial expressions, location, personal and professional relationships, preconceived notions, even furniture arrangement. The point is, a manager should never underestimate the value of interpersonal communication skills. Without them, good management is virtually impossible.